Welcome to the channel, and if this is your first time here, you are truly welcome. Some stories don't begin with noise, chaos, or obvious signs of mystery. Some begin with silence, an unsettling kind of silence that feels heavier the more you think about it. Tonight's story is one of those. It doesn't start with what was seen or what was said, but with what wasn't. Because sometimes, the most powerful presence in any story is not the one that speaks, but the one that remains completely silent. And in this case, that silence may belong to someone who was there all along. It started as a detail so small that most people overlooked it. A passing thought, barely worth holding onto. But over time, that detail refused to disappear. Instead, it lingered, growing heavier, more noticeable, more impossible to ignore. Because when people began looking closer at everything surrounding that night, one question kept returning. Not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. What if someone else was there? Not someone obvious. Not someone mentioned. But someone present. The idea didn't come from evidence laid out clearly. It came from fragments. From moments that didn't fully align. From the subtle feeling that something in the story felt incomplete. Because when people revisited the timeline, when they carefully examined the sequence of events, there were gaps. Not large enough to immediately alarm, but not small enough to dismiss completely either. And that is where the thought began to take shape. If everything had been accounted for, why did the timeline feel like it had missing pieces? Why did certain moments feel too quiet, too smooth, almost as if something had been left out? Not intentionally, perhaps, but noticeably. It's in these quiet inconsistencies that the idea of a silent witness begins to form. Someone who saw something. Someone who heard something. Someone who was present in a moment that others could only piece together from a distance. But for reasons unknown, they never stepped forward. And that is where the story begins to shift. Because the presence of a silent witness changes everything. It transforms the narrative from a closed sequence of events into something open, something unresolved. It introduces a new layer, not of answers, but of possibility. Because if someone was there and chose not to speak, then there are details that exist beyond what has been shared. And that realization is unsettling. Not because it proves anything, but because it suggests that the story people have accepted may not be complete. That there could be perspectives, moments, or truths that remain hidden, not by force, but by silence. People began to think differently after that idea took hold. They stopped focusing only on what was known, and started paying attention to what felt missing. They replayed the events in their minds, not just to understand them, but to sense where something might not fit perfectly. And once you begin looking at a story that way, it becomes difficult to stop. Because the mind starts asking new questions. Questions that weren't there before. If someone was there, where were they positioned? What did they see that others didn't? Were they close enough to understand what was happening, or just far enough to remain unnoticed? And most importantly, why didn't they come forward? Was it fear? Uncertainty? Or something else entirely? Silence, after all, is not always empty. Sometimes, silence is a choice. And when it is, it carries weight. It carries intention. It carries a reason, even if that reason is never revealed. The more people thought about it, the more that silence began to feel significant. Because in situations where something unusual occurs, there is almost always someone who notices more than they say. Someone who observes quietly, who absorbs the moment without becoming part of it. And while others react, speak, or question, this person remains still, unseen, unheard, but not absent. That's what makes the idea of a silent witness so powerful. It suggests that within the story, there exists a hidden perspective. A version of events that has not been spoken. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it hasn't been shared. And that creates tension. A different kind of tension. Not loud or dramatic, but deep and lingering. The kind that stays in the back of your mind, reminding you that what you know might only be part of the truth. As time passed, this idea didn't fade. It grew. It appeared in conversations more often. Not as a statement, but as a possibility. People didn't claim that someone was definitely there. They asked what it would mean if someone had been. And that question alone was enough to change how the story was seen. Because once you consider the possibility of a silent witness, you can't unsee it. Every detail becomes slightly different. Every moment feels like it could hold more than what is visible. Every gap becomes a space where something, or someone, might exist. And suddenly, the story is no longer just about what happened. It becomes about what might have been witnessed. What might have been understood in real time by someone who never spoke. And what might still be waiting in that silence. There is something deeply unsettling about knowing that answers could exist, but remain just out of reach. Not hidden behind walls or locked away, but simply unspoken. Because silence doesn't block truth. It delays it. It keeps it suspended, waiting for a moment that may never come. And in that waiting, the story continues. Not with new evidence, not with clear revelations, but with a growing sense that something is still there, beneath the surface, just beyond what has been said. Because a silent witness does not erase the truth. They carry it, quietly, unnoticed, and perhaps intentionally. And the question that remains is not just whether someone was there, but what they chose to do with what they saw. And the more that thought settled in, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that the story was still incomplete. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that could be easily pointed out or proven, but in a quiet, lingering way that stayed in the background of every conversation. Because once the idea of a silent witness takes hold, everything begins to shift. The focus moves away from what has already been said and leans toward what might still be hidden in plain sight. People began to imagine the scene differently. Not as a closed moment with fixed details, but as a living environment where more than one perspective existed. A place where something could have unfolded in layers, some visible, others unnoticed. And within that layered moment, the possibility of someone standing just outside the center of attention became more real. Not involved, not speaking, but watching. There is something unsettling about being observed without knowing it. It creates a sense of vulnerability, a sense that what seemed private or contained might not have been entirely so. And if someone truly was there that night, witnessing events as they happened, then their silence becomes more than just absence. It becomes a presence of its own. Because silence, when placed beside something significant, begins to feel intentional. People started revisiting small, almost forgettable details. The kind of details that are easy to overlook when you believe you already understand the full picture. A sound that didn't match the surroundings. A pause that felt slightly longer than expected. A shift in atmosphere that couldn't quite be explained, but was felt nonetheless. Individually, none of these meant much. But together, they began to form a pattern. Not a clear one, not a complete one, but enough to suggest that something about that night held more than what was openly acknowledged. And within that pattern, the idea of someone quietly observing started to feel less like imagination, and more like a possibility worth considering. Because in moments where something unusual occurs, there is often a split between those who act and those who watch. The watchers rarely come forward, not because they have nothing to say, but because what they carry is often uncertain. They question what they saw. They wonder if they understood it correctly. They hesitate, unsure whether their perspective matters or whether it would change anything at all. And sometimes, that hesitation turns into silence. A silence that stretches longer than intended. A silence that becomes permanent. But silence does not erase memory. It holds it. Somewhere in the quiet corners of that night, there could be a version of events that exists only in the mind of someone who chose not to speak. Someone who replayed the moment over and over, trying to make sense of it, just like everyone else, but without ever sharing what they experienced. And that possibility changes everything. Because if even one person saw something different, something that didn't align with the story that followed, then the truth becomes larger than what has been told. It becomes layered, complex, and incomplete without that missing perspective. The idea began to settle deeper in the minds of those who followed the story closely. Not as a theory, but as a quiet awareness that perhaps, somewhere out there, someone knows more. Not everything, but more than what has been said. And the question then becomes not just who that person is, but why they have remained silent for so long. Was it fear of being misunderstood? Fear of becoming part of something they never intended to be involved in? Or simply the belief that their voice would not change anything? Because sometimes, people stay silent not because they want to hide the truth, but because they feel powerless to shape it. Still, the silence remains. And the longer it lasts, the heavier it becomes. It turns into something that lingers, something that presses against the edges of the story, reminding everyone that there is still something left unsaid. Something that refuses to fully reveal itself, not because it cannot, but because it has not been allowed to. And that is where the tension truly lives. Not in what is known, but in what is withheld. Because a story can only feel complete when every voice within it has been heard. And if even one voice remains missing, the story carries that absence with it, no matter how much time passes. The silence becomes part of the narrative, not as a gap, but as a presence. A quiet, unspoken presence that exists alongside everything else. And for those who continue to think about that night, who continue to revisit it, who continue to feel that something is still just out of reach, that presence is impossible to ignore. Because deep down, there is a sense that the story is still waiting. Waiting for something. Or someone. Waiting for a moment when silence might finally give way to truth. Until then, the questions remain. Not louder, but deeper. More personal. More persistent. And perhaps that is what makes this story so powerful. It does not force answers. It invites reflection. It does not close itself. It stays open. And in that openness, it continues to live, growing, evolving, and quietly pulling people back into its unanswered depths. Thank you for staying with this story, for allowing yourself to explore not just what is seen, but what is felt. If this kind of mystery, this kind of depth, is something that speaks to you, then you are exactly where you need to be. Make sure you subscribe to the channel Midnight in Seoul, turn on notifications, and stay connected. Because there are more stories like this. Stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you question what might still be hidden. And sometimes, the next story might bring you closer to the voice that never came forward.